Okay, and so I'd like to welcome everyone back here to this shamatha practice program based on observing the mind. So this is the fourth of 6 sessions. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this evening's session. So this evening's session is titled Nature of Mind. And this is related to this resting in awareness practice that we began on Monday. Last week, we did the practice of observing thoughts, and the observing emotions was a variation of that. And then next week, we'll be doing this stillness in motion practice, which is combining these two practices of observing thoughts and resting in awareness. Recommended reading for this program, Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace, and we'll be reading from that book again a couple of times in this evening's session. We'll begin in this session with a meditation, and we'll continue the practice we did on Monday, the resting in awareness practice. Following that, we'll start with a short review of some of the main points, earlier points. Then one of the topics for this evening is meditative experiences, meaning what sorts of experiences can arise in this shamatha practice, and how do we deal with those? And then we'll have a look at the mind, since the previous practice was observing the mind, and now we're resting in awareness. So it's a good idea to know what this mind or awareness is. And so we'll have a brief introduction into that. And then what we'll be doing as the second meditation this evening is crossing that bridge into Vipassana based on the resting in awareness practice. And so we'll look at that practice, and then we'll do a guided meditation. And as normal, time for some question and answer at the end of the session, and finishing with dedication. So this first meditation, so just to review this resting in awareness, to have that clear in our mind before we launch into the meditation. Resting in awareness is sometimes called shamatha with no object, because in this practice, we're turning our awareness in upon itself. So in, for example, mindfulness of breathing, we're aware of the sensations of the breath. In observing thoughts, we're aware of thoughts and emotions and so on. In this practice, we're just simply turning awareness in upon itself and just knowing that we're aware. Meaning that in this practice, we're not paying attention to any appearances, thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. We're not trying to block them, but we're not interested in them. Let them be there. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. And as per normal, to do with the two imbalances in shamatha practice, if we notice any agitation, tension, distraction, to lower the gaze. So remember, in this practice, recommended to have the eyes at least slightly open, so we can lower the gaze, release awareness, release all appearances, relax completely. If we notice we're falling into dullness, drowsiness, or just simply having a completely blank mind, it's good to elevate the gaze slightly and concentrate and sharpen the focus, knowing that you're aware. And if you find that you're completely lost in this practice, maybe you're just completely caught up in thoughts and so forth, or you're completely spaced out and you don't know what you're doing, then you can anchor yourself in the breath. That is, to notice a little bit in the background the rhythm of your breath, and that can anchor yourself to avoid getting caught up in all sorts of appearances. So we're still resting in awareness, but we're noticing the rhythm of the breath a little bit in the background. That's the practice we're going to do. So let's do that practice now. So finding a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. We begin, as always, by preparing the body, meaning setting up a good posture. Back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. Using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension. in any part of the body. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. And relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And then simply releasing all appearances and allowing the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Knowing that you're aware. Resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. And if you notice any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower the gaze, release awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. And if you're noticing that you're falling into dullness, drowsiness, or just being completely spaced out, then elevate the gaze and sharpen your focus, knowing that you're aware. And simply resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. And if you're completely lost in the practice, then anchor yourself in the breath. That is, while resting in stillness, notice the rhythm of your breath a little bit in the background. We can bring the meditation to a close. Let's start with a short review. For shamatha practice, it's recommended to use the object that works best for you. Find the object that works best and stick with that. But also Alan Wallace in his Attention Revolution has another recommendation. And his recommendation is to start with mindfulness of breathing for the first 4 stages of shamatha, meaning that by stage 4, mind is relatively stable and focused. And then from there, you can switch on to more subtler techniques. For example, from the 5th stage to observing thoughts, practice that we did last week. To do that for a number of stages up until about the 8th stage. And then from the 8th stage, for the final 2 stages of shamatha, then shift to the resting in awareness. So that's one recommendation that he gives in his attention revolution. And each one of those 3 objects is particularly suitable for us in the modern world. So let's have a look at each one of those very briefly and see what are the particular advantages of using that object. We saw there the quote from a Sangha from the 4th centuries, recommending that for those people who are very much caught up in a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking, then to really use the breath as the object. So that, I think, accounts for most of us in the modern world. So for many of us, breath is a very good object. And that's what we did in the previous program. And we looked at a number of variations of that breath practice in that program. The full body breath practice, the variation of that is focusing on the rhythm of the breath. Very good for relaxation, cultivating relaxation. Then we went to observing the area of the abdomen. That's very good for increasing stability of attention. And then finally, focusing at the entrance of the nostrils. Very good for enhancing clarity of attention. And some of the advantages of this is, as Sangha said, that by focusing on the breath, that will really help us to get out of our obsessive compulsive thinking mind and into the body. And then also by focusing on the breath, it can help really get us out of the past and the future into the present moment. Because most of our obsessive compulsive thinking is about the past and the future. And the Buddhist assertion is that if we are dwelling in the past or the future, that's a source of a lot of unnecessary unhappiness. So sensations of breath only happen in the present moment, so it helps to get us into the present moment. And also the breath is readily available, it's always there, and compared to other objects such as the mind, it's relatively easy to focus on. Hence, at least begin with mindfulness of breathing, very, very helpful. And then the second object, the observing mind, observing thoughts that we looked at last week. We had that quote from Dujung Lingpa, from the 19th century master from the Dzogchen tradition, nature of mind tradition. So there in that sort of tradition, Dzogchen and Mahamudra very much recommended to use the mind as the object, because that's the object that is investigated in the Vipassana. So therefore proceeding to also use the same object for shamatha. And so here we saw that observing thoughts, this word thought in this context is not just thinking, but it's actually a generic term. It's a translation of a Sanskrit term vikalpa, Tibetan term namdok, which just literally means conceptual activity. So observing all conceptual activity. So not just thinking, but also emotions, memories, mental images, and so forth. So the object that we're observing there, the space of the mind and all the mental events that arise in that space. Many of you probably found that much more challenging than focusing on the breath. And so we introduced a couple of short-term strategies to help us to get into the practice. One was to give a name to the mental event. So labeling or noting, that will help give us some space from the mental event. So not so easily get caught up in it. An alternative short-term strategy is to anchor in the breath. If we find again we're getting swept away all the time, is to focus on the breath and then a little bit in the corner of the mind, notice the thoughts, and then slowly emphasize more of the thoughts. So both of those can be effective short-term strategies to help us to get into that practice if we're just constantly getting swept away by our thoughts. So even though many people find this more challenging than the breath, enormous benefits using this object of shamatha, particularly for us in the modern world, because many of us in the modern world are really tormented and overwhelmed by our thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. And we've really become the slaves of our own mind. By doing this practice, by developing the ability to simply observe our thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth, we will really become the masters of our mind instead of being the slaves of our mind. Also very much a healing practice, because a lot of our psychological problems and even some physical health problems are through suppressing thoughts, emotions, and memories. And so we are releasing that suppression in this practice so it can really start to heal the mind. Also very much known as a bridge into Vipassana practice, to nature of mind practice. And then finally, the practice that we began on Monday, the practice of resting in awareness. We had that quote there from Padmasambhava, who said, while steadily gazing in the space in front of you, without meditating on anything, steadily concentrate your consciousness without wavering. So here again, in this practice is shamatha with no object. We're turning awareness in upon itself and just knowing that we're aware. That's what it means without meditating on anything, no object. Steadily concentrate your consciousness, simply know that you're aware. Without wavering, not paying attention to any appearances and getting caught up in thoughts and sensations and so forth. Many people find this even more challenging than observing thoughts. Not because it's complicated, because it's too simple. Because this practice basically involves doing nothing. In our modern world, we really don't know how to do nothing. We always want to do something. So this practice is more about being than doing. And so if we can appreciate what this practice is about and get into this practice, again, enormous benefits with doing this practice. Because we'll be able, by resting in awareness, we notice that not only is awareness completely still, but it's completely open and spacious. And so by resting in that state, it enables us to let go of our obsessive compulsive thinking mind, a little bit like putting the mind in neutral gear. And then also by doing this practice, we can develop this new default mode in daily life. Instead of having our tight reactionary mind in daily life, some stimulus comes, we react. We can have, instead of that tight reacting mind, have this open, spacious stillness of awareness. And therefore, whatever stimulus comes our way, we can handle that stillness without overreacting to them. And this practice, even more so, is very much a bridge into Vipassana. And we'll be crossing that bridge in the next meditation in the session by introducing, on the basis of this practice, a few Vipassana questions. And so that will come later in this session. So the first topic I'd like to look at in this session is meditative experiences. In Tibetan, this is called nyam. So when we do this sort of shamatha practice, whether we use the breath, the mind, or awareness, all sorts of meditative experiences can arise, and some of them quite intense. And so we really need to know what to do with all these sorts of meditative experiences that could arise so that we don't get derailed by these meditative experiences. So I'd like to look at a couple of different meditative experiences that are likely to arise in shamatha practice. First is physical sensations, particularly more prevalent, but in all shamatha practices, but particularly when we're using the mindfulness of breathing, the breath as the object. When we are focusing on the breath and the mind is settling down, what's happening at a subtle level is that the subtle energies in our body, which now are quite out of balance because of our agitated, disturbed mind, they start to balance in this practice. And the breath is very closely related to those subtle energies as well. And when these subtle energies start to balance in shamatha practice, then all sorts of physical sensations can arise as a result of that. And they can be very varied. Very, very blissful sensations, very pleasant, can be unpleasant, can be very strange sensations. But the general recommendation, of course, is not to get caught up in these sensations, because sometimes we may have a blissful flow of sensations in the body and we go, oh, that's so nice, I like that, I want that. And we try and grab hold of it. And as soon as we do, it goes. And then what we do is we try to recreate that experience because it was so pleasant. And we do that with craving and attachment. And with craving and attachment, those experiences will not return. And we simply end up just getting more and more frustrated. Similarly, if some sort of unpleasant or strange experience arises, we go, oh, what's that? I don't like that. Go away, go away. And we develop a lot of aversion to those experiences. And then our whole practice comes to a grinding halt. So let's have a look in Attention Revolution, Alan Wallace's advice regarding these sorts of physical sensations. And this is on page 48. He says, various physical sensations may occur in meditation. Sometimes you may feel that your limbs are extremely heavy or thick. Sometimes your body may feel very large, or you may feel like that you are floating or levitating. Other sensations such as tingling, vibration, or heat are common. Particularly around the chest area, can be a lot of heat coming up. You may experience telescopic vision, viewing your body as if from a distance. Especially when you meditate many hours a day, you may experience within your body prana or vital energies shifting and releasing pockets of tension. When you engage in mindfulness of breathing, these energies begin to balance and flow naturally. This is a process that takes time, and while the energies redistribute themselves, their movement produces various sensations. Don't be worried about them or make a big deal of them. They are natural consequences of the practice. So don't make a big deal of it. Second point, particularly when we're doing the shamatha practice, observing the mind, observing our thoughts and so forth, as we get into that practice and stop suppressing and the mind becomes more focused and clear, we really start to dredge the depths of our mind, the depths of our psyche. So all sorts of things can come up, long forgotten memories, things we've been suppressing and so forth. And so here also, we need to know what to do when all this stuff starts to come up in our mind. So again, we'll go to Attention Revolution for some advice on what to do in this case. So this is on page 102. And he's talking about the practice of observing thoughts here. He says, in this practice, the locus of awareness gradually descends from superficial level of the coarse mental activity that is immediately accessible through introspection down into the inner recesses of the mind that are normally below the threshold of consciousness. You discover in this training that the border between conscious and unconscious mental events shifts in relation to the degrees of relaxation, stability, and clarity of attention. Especially when you engage in this practice for many hours each day, for days, weeks, or months at a time, you dredge the depths of your own psyche. In doing so, you remember long forgotten experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, and a wide range of desires and emotions. What happens here is a kind of luminously clear discerning, free association of thoughts, mental images, memories, desires, fantasies, and emotions. You are plumbing the depths of your own mind, undistracted by external diversions. Once hidden phenomena are unmasked through the lack of suppression of whatever comes up. This is potentially an extraordinarily deep kind of therapy, and the more intensively you practice it, the more important it is to proceed under the guidance of an experienced, compassionate teacher. During your meditation sessions, internalize the wisdom of this technique, of this contemplative tradition, and make sure that you implement the core instructions of this practice, which are, whatever arises in the mind, do not be carried away by it and do not grasp onto or identify with it. Just let it be. Watch thoughts, feelings, or other mental events arise. With discerning intelligence, be aware of their nature and let them slip back into the space of awareness without any judgment or intervention on your part. This is the key to letting the knots of the psyche unravel themselves as the extraordinary healing capacity of the mind reveals itself. This is the path to deep sanity. And then two other meditative experiences can be quite common: fear and depression. Especially with this resting in awareness practice, but in all shamatha practice, but particularly in the resting in awareness practice, we can have a lot of fear arising. And the main, it's often a sort of an existential fear, because now our normal sense of identity of who we think we are is constantly reinforced by two things. One, solid sense of body. This is me, me, body, me. And then the other thing that's constantly reinforcing our sense of me is all of our mental activity, our thoughts, emotions, memories, all of these things are constantly reinforcing a sense of me. In shamatha practice, when we sit down and set up a good posture and we go into the shamatha practice, particularly resting in awareness, observing the mind, and we have a good posture and we're so focused on the mind, then a sense of body can completely disappear, gone. And then if we're looking at the mind, and whether we're resting in awareness or observing our thoughts, if the mind goes quiet, then all the mental activity, which is reinforcing our sense of me, also gone. So then there's nothing there reinforcing our normal sense of identity. And so we often end up in this existential fear, thinking we either don't exist or we're going out of existence. But this existential fear is completely irrational, because the only thing going out of existence is a false sense of me, a sense of me that's actually the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. So just to comment on this, and again, what to do with it, we can go on page 100 of Attention Revolution, and he says the following. One of the more common challenges in this practice is the emergence of fear. As you release your grip on the contents of the mind, you are undermining your normal sense of personal identity, which is constantly reinforced by thinking, by recalling, and identifying with your personal history, hopes, and plans. Now you are disengaging from these familiar supports for substantiating your ego. As lapses between thoughts occur more and more frequently and for longer periods, your awareness hovers in a kind of empty space, a vacuum devoid of personhood. You may come into the grip of fear as your normal sense of who you are loses its footing. The teacher Genlam Rinpa warned his students that such dread may well arise during their training. It is crucial, he counseled, not to identify with it nor give it any credence. Some kinds of fear are based in reality. They protect us from danger, filling the body with energy so that we can flee or protect ourselves in whatever way necessary. But this kind of dread with no clear object has no such basis in reality. There is no danger in the empty, luminous space of awareness. You have nothing to lose but your false sense of an independent, controlling ego. The only thing being threatened is an illusion. If you don't identify with it, there's nothing to fear. If you do identify with this fear, it may bring your entire practice to a grinding halt and throw you into deep emotional imbalances. So it is of utmost importance to observe such fear without distraction and without grasping. Keep to the essentials of the practice. And then he goes on to talk a bit about depression. He says, another emotional imbalance that may crop up at any time during this training is depression, which may be related to a deep-rooted sense of guilt and low self-esteem. When any of these emotions or attitudes arise during meditation sessions, treat them like any other mental event. That is, watch their emergence, see how they linger, then observe them disappear back into the space of the mind. Examine them with discerning intelligence, but without any emotional charge. Rather than identifying with them or owning them, let them emerge from the space of awareness and dissolve back without any intervention on your part, even without any preference for them to go away. Let the space of your mind be emotionally neutral, like physical space, which could not care less whether bullets or hummingbirds streak through it. So I think some very good advice there from Attention Revolution. And then the other experiences that we looked at, I think on Monday, what that can come up are these three qualities of mind of clarity, non-conceptuality, and bliss, the deeper we go into the practice, the more we'll start to taste these experiences of a mind becoming more and more clear, more non-conceptuality in terms of stillness and bliss and joyful mind. And again, the advice here is that all these three experiences, clarity, stillness, and bliss, are very pleasant, very easy to get caught up in them with craving and attachment. So just don't get caught up with craving and attachment. Simply use these experiences as a signpost that the practice is going in the right direction, and use these very experiences to go deeper into the practice. So therefore, what we can see here is that in terms of shamatha practice, we can have all sorts of meditative experiences, physical and mental, pleasant, unpleasant, strange, the whole lot is possible. And they can arise unexpectedly at any time. We don't know what's going to happen. So therefore, the advice with all of these experiences, don't make a big deal of them. We tend to make a big deal of them. We end up having craving and attachment to the pleasant, aversion to the unpleasant. So therefore, to simply observe these meditative experiences without hope or fear. So if they're pleasant experiences, without hope that they're going to stay there, and without the fear that they're going to go away. For the unpleasant and strange experiences, without the hope that they go away, and without fear that they're going to stay there. So without hope or fear, whatever arises, let it be there, arise and pass, stick to the practice. Otherwise we get sidetracked in all sorts of meditative experiences. And now we'll look at the mind before we go back to the practice of resting in awareness, particularly with the Vipassana aspect to it. First, a little bit of terminology. So here when we talk about mind, there are often three terms used commonly: mind, in Sanskrit chitta, consciousness, in Sanskrit vijnana, and awareness, in Sanskrit vidya. Each one of these three terms has a specific meaning. The mind is a sort of more general term. Consciousness has this idea of knowing, perceiving, and awareness has quite similar, knowing, seeing. But when we speak generally in terms of simply knowing or being a knower, then these three terms, mind, consciousness, and awareness, are equivalent in meaning. So when we say observing mind, we can say observe consciousness, observe awareness. They're interchangeable when we speak very generally. In specific contexts, they take on different meanings. Particularly this word awareness is used in many different ways. We have to be very careful when we see this word awareness. Unfortunately, it's very popular, and many translators translate different Sanskrit terms with the same word awareness. So it gets very confusing. So when we see the word awareness, we have to try and dig a little bit and see, how is this person using this word awareness? And then when we talk about the Dzogchen and Mahamudra systems of practice within Tibetan Buddhism, then mind and awareness tend to have very specific meanings. And in fact, mind and awareness are mutually exclusive, meaning if it's mind, it's not awareness. If it's awareness, it's not mind. Because mind here, in this context, is generally used as a term to mean conditioned mind, meaning our coarse level of mind and subtle level of mind, this conditioned mind. Whereas awareness is usually referring to the very most deep level of our mind, the very subtle level of mind. And we'll look at these three levels of mind shortly. So that's a little bit of terminology. So now just a couple of very brief presentations on mind. First, a very general definition of mind is that mind is that which is clear and knowing. Sometimes translated as mind is that which has clarity and awareness. In this two-word definition, the first word is describing the entity or the nature, and the second word is the function. For example, the definition, a simple definition of fire is that fire is hot and burning. So what is the entity or nature of fire? Is heat. What does fire do? It burns. So what is the entity or nature of mind? The mind is clear or has clarity. What does the mind do? It knows, it is aware. And this word clear or clarity has two implications. One is because the mind is clear or has clarity means the mind is not physical. So the mind is not the brain, a property of the brain, emergent property of the brain, or a function of the brain. And the other meaning of the word clear or clarity, because the mind is clear, has clarity, therefore it allows appearances. Appearances can arise in the mind, thoughts, emotions, images, and so forth. And what does the mind do? It knows, it is aware, it engages with these appearances. So that's a very simple definition of mind. Where did the mind come from? What is its origin? Like all physical things in the world, it arises through causes and conditions. What is the substantial cause? What transforms, for example, into the present moment of mind is the previous moment of mind. And the cooperative conditions are all the various physical and mental processes that are going on that contributes to that transformation. And here we have, very similar to classical physics, where in classical physics we have this theory of conservation of consciousness, mass energy, that you can't create mass energy, you can't destroy it. Similarly, in Buddhism, we have a similar theory of conservation of consciousness. You can't create it, you can't destroy it. And therefore, the implications of this theory is that consciousness is beginningless and endless, just as matter and energy are beginningless and endless. We can, of course, talk about the beginning of this universe in terms of the Big Bang, but that's not the same as the beginning of mass energy. Similarly, we can talk about the beginning of our life, but that's not the same as the beginning of consciousness. Or we can talk about the beginning of the mind of this life. That had a beginning, but the beginning of consciousness is beginningless, endless. And then when we look at mind in a little bit more detail, we can look at mind in a number of different ways. One is in terms of objects, that with mind, we can perceive 6 types of objects. We can perceive the 5 sense objects, that is visual objects, sounds, smell, taste, and tactile. But we can also perceive mental objects, thoughts, emotions, and so forth. So since we can perceive 6 types of objects, we can talk about 6 types of consciousnesses. So the 6 consciousnesses is mental consciousness and the 5 sense consciousnesses. Mental consciousness is the aspect of the mind that perceives thoughts, emotions, and so forth. And for example, visual consciousness is aspect of mind that perceives visual objects. We're not talking about 6 separate consciousnesses. There's just one consciousness, one mind. These are 6 aspects of the one mind. We can also talk about the mind in terms of levels and functioning. So let's have a look at those 2 in a little bit more detail. In terms of levels of mind, we can break mind into 3 levels. The coarse level of mind is the level of mind that is active now, that's thinking and remembering and planning and so forth and seeing things and so forth. And so this is equivalent to the psyche. And within this level of mind, there are, of course, a whole bandwidth of levels. There's what's called conscious level and subconscious. Conscious, what we're aware of, subconscious, what we're not aware of. So there's a whole bandwidth there. But below the coarse mind, at a deeper level, we have a subtle level of mind, sometimes called substrate consciousness. And this is the ground state of the coarse mind. This is the level from which mental events emerge and dissolve back into. In the Geluk school, this is often called subtle mental continuum. And this level of mind is what we access in shamatha practice. So we are refining the coarse mind in shamatha. We're bringing that threshold down, 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 below the coarse mind, down to the subtle level. So when we achieve shamatha, we are at the level of the subtle mind. That's the level of mind we use in Theravada and Mahayana vehicles as the basis for Vipassana, to come to insights, to overcome mental affliction, suffering, and achieve nirvana, enlightenment. But then we can also talk about very subtle level of mind, often called primordial consciousness. Also goes by the name of mind of clear light, pristine awareness, Rigpa, many different names. And this is the ground state of consciousness in general. And this level of mind is atemporal and non-local. Atemporal means beyond time. So both coarse and subtle mind is within time. The very subtle mind is beyond time, and non-local means not individuated. We can talk about my coarse mind and my subtle mind, but you can't really say my very subtle mind. It really doesn't make sense. It's not individuated. But not individuated doesn't mean it's all one. That's dualistic. This level of mind we access through Tantra or Vajrayana practice. And it's this level of mind that is then utilized in Vipassana to realize emptiness, to then accelerate the path to enlightenment. So this very subtle level of mind is only something that we have tools in Tantra or Vajrayana to gain access to. So shamatha practice, we're simply trying to refine the coarse mind, bring it down to the subtle level, and then we use that in our Vipassana practice. And then in terms of functioning of the mind, we can talk about how does the mind function in our experiences. We can divide the mind into two there, what's called primary mind and mental factors. So primary mind is simply the raw experience of the object. And in all the mental factors, fill in that experience, determine what sort of experience we have of the object. And so here we can talk about 51 mental factors. And this is a whole system of study you can find within Tibetan Buddhism called Lorig, minds and awarenesses, where it talks also, part of that topic is a lot of discussion about these mental factors. Very briefly, these 51, there are 26 mental afflictions. So we seem like our mind is quite dysfunctional very often. We have 11 virtuous mental factors. We have 5 universal mental factors, which are always present in all of our experiences. We have 5 object determining mental factors that when these are stable, we have certainty about the object. And then we have 4 changeable mental factors that, depending on the context, can either be virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral. So I won't go into this detail here. This is a whole subject matter itself. But this, by studying this mental factors, we can really get a good appreciation of how our mind is functioning, and thereby start to work with our mind, how to eliminate those mental afflictions and how to develop the qualities of mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, love, compassion, and so forth. So that's a little bit about the mind. And then last point is nature of mind. When we talk about nature of mind, we can talk about conventional nature of mind and ultimate nature of mind. So the conventional nature of mind is simply the fact that the mind, its conventional nature is that the mind is clear and knowing, has clarity and awareness. And that is something we realize through shamatha practice. Even though the mind is clear and knowing now, we don't see that because our mind is obscured, caught up in mental afflictions, it's dull, distracted. We don't really see that clarity and knowing quality of the mind. But as we engage in shamatha practice, and the mind becomes more stable and clear, then we really do directly see these qualities of mind, the clarity and knowing quality of the mind. Then we can talk about the ultimate nature of the mind. And ultimate nature of the mind in the Mahayana, which is the level we're operating here in terms of shamatha vipassana, the ultimate nature of the mind is simply emptiness, that the mind is empty of independent existence. And so we realize this through vipassana practice, that we investigate the mind and we come to realize the mind is empty of inherent existence. When we talk about Vajrayana or Tantra, where we're gaining access to that very subtle level of mind, then the nature of the mind is exactly that. It is that very subtle level of mind, pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, that is indivisible from emptiness. So it's a little bit different way of talking about ultimate nature of the mind, whether we're talking about operating at the subtle level of mind or the very subtle level of mind. So let's now go to the practice that we're going to do. We're going to do the resting in awareness practice, but we're going to add a little bit of questioning to it, which means we're now moving to Vipassana territory. So the initial instruction, as before, is while steadily gazing in the space in front of you, without meditating on anything, steadily concentrate your consciousness without wavering. So again, just simply resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. We'll start there for a little while, for some minutes. Then we'll introduce some questioning. And here Padmasambhava, he says, occasionally seek out, what is that consciousness that is concentrating? Steadily concentrate again and then check it out again. Do that in an alternating fashion. Even if there are problems of laxity and lethargy, that will dispel them. When we engage in this sort of questioning, we move into Vipassana practice. But here, Padmasambhava is using this questioning to help us in shamatha. Because if we need to investigate the mind based on some question, then we need to pay very close attention. Otherwise, we can't see anything. So therefore, by asking the question and investigating, that'll sharpen our attention and thereby help us to overcome laxity and lethargy. So that's what he's saying here. And then he goes on, he says, alternate between observing who is concentrating inwardly and who is releasing. If it is the mind, ask, what is that very agent that releases the mind and concentrates the mind? And steadily observe yourself again, then release again. So what he's talking about here is alternating, that we're resting in awareness, then we ask a question, we look, and then we rest again. We question, we rest. So we're alternating between shamatha and vipassana. And he says, by so doing, fine stillness will arise, meaning our mind will become very focused because of that. And he says, you may even identify pristine awareness, which is the nature of the mind. So he's saying that even though these Vipassana questions are to help us to develop fine stillness, i.e. good concentration, because we're investigating, we may even come to an insight into the nature of our mind. And so that's what we're going to do now. So just to summarize the practice again, and then we'll go straight to the meditation. Again, we'll start as a standard shamatha practice, resting in awareness, just knowing we're aware. Again, if you find yourself agitated, tense, or distracted, lower the gaze, release everything, dull, elevate, sharpen the focus. And then we're going to introduce a couple of questions as we go through the practice. Like, for example, who is releasing awareness? Who is concentrating? Who is resting in awareness? Now, with these questions, we're not trying to intellectually answer the questions. That's not Vipassana practice. These questions are the basis on with which we observe through direct observation. We try to answer these questions through our direct observation and not through some intellectual answer. That's not Vipassana practice. So we do look briefly, and then we rest again. We look, we rest. So let's do that practice now and see if this questioning can help us to become more focused and clear, and maybe even get some taste in the nature of the mind. If you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin that practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. Allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And then simply releasing all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest. Resting in awareness itself. Simply knowing that you're aware. And if there's any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower the gaze, release awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. Who is it that is releasing awareness into space? Don't try to intellectually answer this. Just look. Look closely. Who's the agent doing the releasing? And then rest again. Resting in the stillness of awareness. And if you notice any dullness or drowsiness, elevate the gaze and sharpen your focus. Concentrate, knowing that you're aware. Who is concentrating? Just look. And then rest again. Resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. Who is resting in awareness? Look closely. And release all investigation and just rest. Resting in the open, spacious stillness of awareness. Knowing that you're aware. We bring the meditation to a close. Now we have some time for question answer. Do we have any questions, Miffy?
Well, I have a couple. So
Sure, fire
one
away.
of them about the unanswerable question when we're doing this meditation. I must admit I had, I found it an unanswerable question, but I also had the thought going through my mind, is this some kind of sick Zen joke to even have to ask a question like this? So I don't know if I'm doing it right, doing it wrong, even getting close to it. No idea.
Yeah. So what I briefly mentioned there was when we bring in questioning, whether it's this sort of questioning or other questioning in the context of Vipassana, this questioning is to guide our investigation. And that investigation is through our direct experience. So the first thing we need to do, if we want to attempt to do any Vipassana practice correctly, is give the intellectual mind a holiday. If we're intellectually answering these questions, then we're not doing any sort of Vipassana practice. We're just confirming our belief system. So, we may have, through our studies, come to the understanding, well, there's no separate agent. So when the question is, who's doing this? Then the intellectual mind goes, I know, there's no one there. There's no agent there. Okay, next question. So then we're not doing it, because the thing is that in our experience, there really does seem to be someone there doing this, doesn't it? I mean, when we're meditating and we are releasing awareness into space, we are focusing the mind, when we are resting, there seems to be an agent who's doing all of this, isn't there?
There does, but then
Right.
when you ask the question, I just thought it was really funny. Like,
Correct. Because if we do this practice well, what we just blindly accept that, yeah, there's me, I'm here, I'm releasing, I'm doing all of this. If we look, where is that agent? Where is the observer? And that's why if we do it correctly, then often a couple of experiences can happen. We saw earlier, one experience can be fear, that we look and we go, I can't see any agent there doing this releasing or this resting. There doesn't seem to be a separate agent who is resting. And then we can come into this existential fear, thinking, oh, I don't exist, or I'm going out of existence. But that we stick with that experience, because that sort of experience of not finding what we think is there, that's an insight into the nature of the mind. That's an insight into emptiness. And so if we do this investigation, and that's why Padmasambhava, he was introducing this questioning in the context of shamatha, because you may have experienced that to investigate, we have to really pay close attention. So if we were dull, then generally the dullness is sort of gone, at least temporarily, because we have to pay close attention. And that's why, that's the main reason he was introducing this question here, because it's a shamatha practice, is to overcome dullness, to improve clarity and focus. But he said, this, if you do this, you'll achieve this stillness, this clarity and focus. And you may identify pristine awareness, which is nature of mind. So, you might actually come to an insight into the nature of mind through doing this question, because it is once we ask a question, we're in Vipassana territory.
okay, then also you mentioned just briefly with the different levels of mind, and I think it might have been a more subtle level where you said it was not individuated.
Correct, the very subtle mind.
Yeah, what does that mean?
It means they're not individuated. It means that it's not like my very subtle mind versus your very subtle mind. So what we say is that, even to say my very subtle mind doesn't, it sounds a bit awkward, but let's say it, my very subtle mind, your subtle mind, just for the sake of an argument. What we're saying here is that my very subtle mind, your very subtle mind are neither the same nor different.
Okay, so is it
Because
in
same
that?
and different is if you're talking things are being individuated. If you talk about two things are either the same or different. But here, there's no two things. There's not like my very subtle mind and your very subtle mind. It's two different things. But that doesn't mean there's one very subtle mind for everyone, because that's still individuated. That's still dualistic. So that's why not individuated. The very subtle mind is beyond one or many.
So could you say it's beyond being able to use that word my in my subtle
Correct.
mind?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't. I mean, it's because this very subtle mind is the basis for all of samsara and nirvana. Time arises from very subtle mind. The whole of samsara and nirvana arises out of this. So then how can you say my very subtle mind? It doesn't really make sense.
Because that idea of my is in that samsaric kind of course
Yeah,
realm.
I mean, yeah, exactly. That's why we can say my subtle mind, because that subtle mind, we're still in samsara, and it's individuated. You can talk about my coarse mind, my subtle mind, your coarse mind, your subtle mind, but to say my very subtle mind, your very subtle mind, it really just doesn't compute.
Okay. Then there is a question, do we go into like a cloud of subtle mind when we die?
So this subtle mind, we can, this is sort of like the continuity from life to life. So in Galuk, they often talk about the subtle mental continuum. You know, what goes from life to life? Subtle mental continuum. What has the karmic seed? Subtle mental continuum. So that's the sort of the level of mind there.
And then an associated question from Ian, that when we ask that question, the who is question, then is acknowledgement of the higher self also going against the process of this meditation? So there's kind of like an idea of a higher self, possibly in our pop culture. So,
right, but this is an intellectual idea, isn't it? It's a belief.
It's a belief, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these things, you know, soul, higher consciousness, even using Buddhist terms, no self, all of these is just beliefs, which may or may not be correct or accurate, but that's irrelevant in this practice, because in this Vipassana practice, we're being empirical scientists. We want to discover the truth. Is it true that there's a higher self? Is it true that there's a soul? Is it true that there's an independent me? This is what we want to discover through our direct experience.
So that's really the key, that not to work it out as a philosophical theory, but to...
No, well, yeah, I mean, we can have all sorts of belief systems, but here what Vipassana is all about, discovering reality. What is the reality? And then based on our experience, then we can see whether our belief system sort of matches that or not. And if it does, then we can go, oh, I had a very good belief system. I validated it. Or we can throw it out the window because our experience has shown us that our belief system was wrong.
Then a couple less esoteric questions. So one from the first meditation, that when you mentioned about not spacing out, what do you mean by that?
Well, not spacing out. I mean, generally, if we're really spaced out, we don't know we're spaced out until after we've come out of that. I mean, if we're really spaced out, we've lost awareness, where we're sort of, the mind has sunk down to a level where we're no longer conscious. I mean, very heavy spaced out is we actually fall asleep. But before that, we can get into this state, and we've had this many times through the day, many times, where we space out and we go into this zone where we're not really aware of anything, and then someone says something and we go, oh, did you say something? Because we weren't aware of anything. So that's the danger with this practice we're doing now of resting in awareness, is because we're not paying attention to any appearances, then the danger is that we just sink. And it's very nice. And it seems like we're doing the practice because I'm not paying any attention. In fact, I don't notice any appearances at all because our mind is sinking. And it sinks so much that we sort of go basically unconscious, more or less. And then a little bit later we go, oh, hang on, where was I? So this is sort of, I mean, spacing out, of course, has many gradients. We can be sort of half spaced out where we're sort of aware, we're not really paying attention to anything, but we still have a little bit of awareness. But then when that sinks more, completely spaced out, we're not aware of it until after. We go, oh, I was just spaced out because nothing was registering there for the last 10 seconds. That's spaced out. So spaced out here means heavy dullness.
Okay.
And that's a danger in this practice of resting in awareness, is to sink into that dullness, because it's a very nice, cozy experience.
Yeah,
and to mistake that for actually doing the practice well.
So it's quite alluring. So I suppose
that absolutely, because we're getting away from all that blah 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 that's tormenting us, and we go, oh, this is very nice. I like this. I like this. And all we're doing is we are increasing dullness.
Oh dear. Then Lisa has a question. Is movement like rocking or swaying a typical physical sensation during meditation?
In this shamatha practice, quite a number of people have movement, and sometimes very sharp movements. This is really releasing energy, a lot of energy. So I have a number of people in my courses that really mention that they have this like twitches, like quite violent twitches sometimes. Of course, we can have that as a physiological condition that we need to address with a doctor. But here in shamatha practice, if we don't normally have that, and particularly if we notice that our mind is becoming very quiet and focused and very concentrated, then suddenly all this twitching comes. Yes, this can be one of these nyams, releasing a lot of pockets of energy and so forth.
And what about just like a sensation, a bit like, say, vertigo or...
we can have, like I said, tingling, vibration, heat, floating, levitating, big body, small body, heavy body, light body. All of these things are possible.
Okay. And then you've mentioned the words Dzogchen and Mahamudra. So there's a question. So what is Mahamudra?
Right. In fact, good question, because we're going to, and we're just finishing off the session now, we're going to look at that very thing next session, next Monday. Is in the next Monday, the stillness in motion practice. The topic I want to cover, and stillness in motion is basically we're going to combine these two practices of observing thoughts, resting, and awareness into what's called stillness in motion. And the topic I'm going to introduce in the session on Monday is that this Mahamudra system of practice is the one that's mainly practiced in the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. Dzogchen is in the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, in the Geluk school, it's mainly the Lam Rim is the main system of practice. But also in Geluk, there is a Mahamudra system of practice, particularly coming from Panchen Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, the great Tibetan master who is the tutor of the 5th Dalai Lama. And so what I'd like to do is introduce the shamatha part of his Mahamudra text on Monday. So Mahamudra, sometimes translated as great seal, and Mahamudra, it just means nature. It basically, the great seal is the nature of mind, is emptiness, empty nature of mind. And we'll look at that. We'll look at the shamatha, the brief shamatha section of his text on Monday, in the context of Mahamudra.
Fantastic.
Okay, I think if one last question, or we'll leave it there.
No, that's it. That's the questions.
Okay, so let's finish by dedicating. So I'll just get the slide up again. As we've been doing, let's dedicate all of our efforts from this session this evening on the basis of Shantideva dedication prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain a notion of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are warm with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Next session on Monday, session 5 of 6, stillness in motion, as I mentioned, combining these two practices of resting in awareness, observing thoughts. And the main associated topic with that practice is the shamatha section of this Guluk Mahamudra text from Panchen Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen. So some practical instructions about these sorts of shamatha practices from that text. So until then, have a good weekend and look forward to seeing you same time Monday evening. So